This is ESG Decoded, the podcast powered by Global Affairs Associates to provide relevant, actionable updates related to business innovation and sustainability. Join Kaitlyn Allen and Amanda Shea of Global Affairs Associates for thoughtful, nuanced conversations with industry leaders that explore the complexities, the risks, and the opportunities connected to all things ESG. I'm Yvonne Harris, a consultant and co-host, and I will be collaborating with Kaitlyn and Amanda for the discussions that we will present on this podcast. Put simply, ESG is everything that is not on your balance sheet. This leaves room for misunderstanding, oversimplification, and the tendency towards one-size-fits-all perspectives. None of that will happen on this podcast. Enjoy this episode.
Welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today I'm sitting with Andrew Bruce, who's the founder and CEO of Data Gumbo, a Houston-based technology company that has developed GumboNet, the massively interconnected industrial smart contract network powered and secured by blockchain. And we will explain what that means in a few minutes. Under Andrew's leadership, Data Gumbo is now an award-winning disruptive innovator as recognized in the Forbes 2020 Energy Awards with industrial customers around the world. Andrew was also named a 2020 finalist for Ernst & Young's Entrepreneur of the Year Award in the Gulf Coast area. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We are starting to do something a little different for our regular listeners. We usually do our fun question at the end, and we're going to switch that and get started at the beginning. So I want to just start by asking Andrew, where are you from? Tell us a little bit about that. And can I pronounce Worcester correctly?
No, you can't. Worcester, yeah. From the Isle of Man, which is halfway between England and Ireland, in the middle of the Irish Sea. Famous for tax evasion and motorcycle racing. If you've heard of the Isle of Man TT, it's June every year. Also, probably not famous, but is infamous. The Bee Gees were born there. So there is a new statue of the Bee Gees on the seafront in Douglas. Came to America to go to university to study computer science in Worcester, Massachusetts. So I got my degree in computer science from Worcester, went to London to work on trading systems in London, then worked on trading systems in Houston. And some sales guy sold a project to the CEO of NOV, which required somebody who had energy on their business card. And I was only one in the company. So I went and worked on a week-long strategy session for Pete and his direct reports. And that's how I got into the drilling business. I'd never seen a drilling rig in my life before that. And so worked for NOV, ultimately building an autonomous rig, which was the foundation of Data Gumbo. Why we got into this business, I went and ran global operations for MH Worth, Norwegian company doing offshore drilling equipment, and then started Data Gumbo in December of 2015.
Awesome. What do you miss most about Isle of Man?
The sea. To get to school, I had to ride my bike down the beach. It's fabulous when the wind's not blowing like hell. So you'd open up your blazer on the way to school, and either you would get blown to school or you'd be in first gear trying to go against the wind. It's very windy there all the time. But yeah, growing up close to the sea and the storms and things like that are epic. So yeah, I miss being close to the sea.
Sounds very beautiful. I've never been.
There's lots of jellyfish in the water and it's bloody cold.
So not as much swimming, perhaps.
No,
as
Galveston. No, but the water's clear. You can see straight to the bottom, unlike Galveston. So
that's definitely different than Galveston. Thanks so much for that. You and I have spoken several times now, but I think, I've heard about smart contracts now from you a couple of times, and I'm starting to wrap my head around what that means. But let's just start with the basics. What is a smart contract? And give us a couple of examples so folks know what we're talking about today.
a smart contract is nothing more than an algorithm, right? I mean, it's how do you capture the intent of a contract between one or more counterparties? I'll give you a really, really simple example, and it's not technically a smart contract, but it gives you the idea. So you go to a gas station, you select the gas that you want to pump, you swipe your credit card, you pump the gas, and then you leave. So now you have made an automated payment between your bank and the gas station's bank, and you've agreed to the grade of the gas that you're pumping and the price of the gas that you're pumping and the volume of the gas that you're pumping. So you have executed essentially a smart contract. So in a very simplistic way, that's what we do on an industrial scale.
Okay, so give us an example from one of your clients. So you're working primarily today in the oil and gas industry. I know there's applications across lots and lots of different industries, but could you give us an example of what one of your clients might use it for?
Yeah, so it could be wastewater from a well, right? So the oil company would like to reduce the cost and have better visibility into their spend. And the trucking company wants to get paid on time for services delivered. So you could measure how much water is taken from the wastewater tank, how much water is put onto the truck that's taking the wastewater, and you can measure how much water is put into a saltwater disposal well. You can do a three-way match between those three data sources, and if it is within a tolerance that all the different parties agree to, then you can automate the payment for that transaction. And so you remove the back office expenses, you remove any disagreements between the counterparties. So in a recent implementation we did for a company delivering production chemicals, the same concept, measuring how many chemicals were delivered, 98% of all transactions went through with no human intervention. And so that means that you can reduce your back office expenses. I think they said they saved 12,000 hours a year just with one vendor, because they were not having to chase pieces of paper and chase their tail trying to figure out whether or not, and check every invoice. I mean, in the reality, most companies don't check every invoice, and there's a lot of payments that go through sight unseen. So the bigger picture is that now, and this is getting to the real value, oil companies can run their business of actual expenses rather than accruals and estimates halfway into next month. So you know it all, but a company knows at all times what their revenue is, what their expenses, and they can back it up with measurements from the field. So there's no interpretation required. There's actual measurement. And all that data is stored in a blockchain for both sides. And this is the key, is all parties to the transaction have got a complete record of all the transactions that happen. Neither side of them can change it because it's in a blockchain. And so now you've created trust in an untrusted environment.
And so when you say it's actuals, this is the use of real sensors on a real physical tank, right?
Correct.
Okay, so it's not, like you said, an estimate or here's the bill we sent after, did our guy in the field write it down correctly? All of that's essentially eliminated because you're using, I assume, IoT-enabled sensors, Internet of Things.
Correct.
IoT. And so I'm just trying to picture a tank, right? So there's a sensor on the tank.
So there's a sensor, there's a flow meter on the tank, there's a flow meter on the truck, and there's a flow meter on the saltwater disposal well.
Okay.
I mean, obviously there could be slight variations in the accuracy of the flow meters, but as long as it's within, for the water we did, I think it was 1.6%. As long as it's in 1.6% of accuracy between the 3 meters, then it's a valid transaction, therefore a valid payment.
Brilliant. And so I think this is where, probably a lot of folks who are listening, they're like, what does any of this have to do with ESG, ESG Decoded? But this is where we're getting to the juicy part related to ESG, because all of that real-time data, whether it's a fuel tank, for example, that's how we make emissions data, right? Is fuel consumption, or water, wastewater, all of these things. This is all ESG data.
Correct. Yeah.
It's now, well, I guess E&S, and in a way like backed up by G, right? By a good governance process and by the trustworthiness of the blockchain, where you feel confident in the data. It's a pathway from going from estimates-based E&S data to, or I suppose E, really, in this case, all of this is E data. From estimates-based to actually IoT-enabled, sensor-based, real-time actuals.
With full audit capabilities. Yes, that's correct. So I'll anticipate your question. We've had a hunch for a long time that if we can measure the actual utilization of machines and the actual fuel delivered or the fuel used or the water picked up, that we should be able to provide scope 1, 2, and 3 ESG reporting, well, ENS anyway, specifically the E for this case. You can get the S by connecting into the the corporate systems that already exist. But we tried this theory with some attorneys in town who specialize in ESG, and they pointed us towards SASB and said, you really need to look at the SASB standards because they're being well received by the corporate world. And so we did an analysis of the data that you need for SASB reporting and the data that we were collecting to automate the payments or the provenance of deliveries in the field. And there's about a 98% overlap. So what we discovered, much to our pure luck, I guess you could say, is that we could use the exact same data that we were using for automating payments and tracking deliveries and tracking the provenance of equipment or anything else. And then we could write another smart contract that was designed against exactly the same data to spit out in a SASB compliance report or a GRI standard report or any other ESG standard that people want to use. And the beautiful thing from a company perspective is that it is backed with a full audit back to the field ticket, as we've already talked about. So we know exactly what sensor was read, what the value of the sensor was, and the resulting emissions or carbon that is associated with that transaction. So it's a beautiful thing, really, because you get the savings on the commercial side, and you can basically pay for your ESG reporting by the savings you get from your operational efficiency.
Let me just say, for those who might not be familiar or listening to the pod for the first time, SASB stands for Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And Andrew also mentioned GRI, that's the Global Reporting Initiative. So 2 of the top frameworks for ESG reporting. This sort of, in a way, is a very concrete validation of the SASB standards, for one, in terms of being things that are truly material to a company's operations and truly have an impact on either the top and or bottom line of a company. And I think it's very interesting that 98% overlap with SASB. I think that just shows that SASB's done their homework in terms of what things actually in the E and S and G universes, which things actually correlate to operational data, like what actually correlates to operational improvement, which companies are being most efficient with their use of natural resources and keeping costs lower by utilizing less or utilizing natural resources more efficiently. So I think that 98% is really, really interesting. Have you done that for GRI as well?
No, we didn't do that for GRI. We just did it to validate the concept.
Yeah, no, I think it's makes a lot of sense.
I've never thought of it the way that you just put it, but it's actually a very, very insightful thought that you had. That it's a huge validation of SASB's approach. And the other thing for a company is that they're not going to have to go and find a bunch of data that is specifically or uniquely required for ESG. So they don't have to go out of their operations and go buy sensors that they don't need outside their operational processes just to satisfy the ESG standard. So what you've pointed out is, I think, is really important, is the data that companies need for ESG actually exists within their own companies today. Maybe they're not using it as such, and kind of
or they're not even tracking it sometimes.
Well, exactly right. Yeah, that's more often the case. We often get asked when we meet somebody new, where are we going to get this data from? It's like, well, you probably exist within your own company. And then the next question is, well, our data is lousy. Well, here's an opportunity for you to improve your profits by doing so, and at the same time being able to provide defensible ESG. And I think that's the key word, is defensible, because I'm kind of leading the witness here, or maybe you're leading the witness. I don't know which way around it is, but there's a lot of people who make estimates of reports. And now that's no longer going to be good enough, because why do you need to use an estimate when you can use actual numbers? So I think that's going to be the trend over the next 5 years, is going to be, how do we measure what's actually going on rather than just coming up with an Excel spreadsheet, an estimated report?
Yeah. And I mean, I want to say too that using Excel estimates is the standard practice, and it still is. Why? Because a lot of this IoT sensor-based stuff is new, right? And it's more affordable now than it was even a few years ago. So I think you're right, and that it's going to trend toward more of this actual stuff. But I don't want to disparage the Excel estimates, just because that is really how a lot of this is still done. And they are science-based, multipliers, science-based spreadsheets. People have worked for many years to make them accurate. So it's not necessarily that those are bad. It's just that we have these new technologies that can make the data better and more interconnected, more defensible, as you said, and just less room for error, frankly. I mean, we fully trust the accuracy of an Excel estimate that's based on many years of scientifically proven ranges and whatnot, but it's still humans doing the Excel, right? So I think that's the nice thing about this next generation of sensor-based, IoT-enabled, blockchain-type data, is that you're really eliminating the human error potential. But more broadly speaking, I mean, I think about things like a carbon tax, putting a price on carbon. Well, we're going to need the infrastructure and systems to make it happen, but also just make sure it's fair. And it sounds like smart contracts would have a role to play in making sure any price on carbon is fair. What do you think about that?
Yeah, first of all, I didn't mean to disparage Excel spreadsheet and the analysis and science that goes behind that.
I didn't think you did. I just wanted to make
intention.
sure.
Yeah.
Because we still do a lot of those for clients, really.
And I would go one step further than that and say that the science that's been used behind the Excel is going to be captured in smart contracts. So all the same brains and science behind the Excel spreadsheets can be captured in smart contracts. So I think that a lot of the people who are working in the ESG space today are going to have a very bright future helping think through and quite frankly owning the IP of some of these smart contracts, so that there's a way of them monetizing their expertise outside maybe they have their traditional revenue sources. So I think that it's going to be a tremendous collaboration going forward as we understand better how to measure ESG and report on it. And that kind of gets back to your question. So carbon tax is a really interesting question, because I don't know about you, but if I'm being taxed, I want to make sure that the basis for the taxation is consistent. Right. And that I'm being taxed based on the same criteria as the guy down the road from me, and it's not subjective. Mm-hmm. So I think that in order for any kind of a carbon tax to be implemented, there has to be a consistent and mechanical way of measuring. Otherwise, you can't have a basis for the taxation.
Yeah,
it's very much like accounting standards boards. You have an accounting standards boards so that you make sure that you've got consistent reporting of financial results. It's the same thing in this circumstance. We want to make sure that we've got consistent standards mm-hmm. that we are using for A, reporting, and B, taxation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly a role to play here. And, I think about the efficiency too. We have so many, I look at a lot of our clients, so many brilliant, highly educated people spending a third of their year filling out a CDP report and doing GHG calculations. And you just think, we don't want to get rid of those people. We want to unleash those people to actually spend their time doing strategy, thinking about the big problems, implementing real change at their companies, not doing the GHG calculations, right? And yet there seems to be a lot of barriers. What barriers do you see in getting companies to adopt smart contracts?
It's change. I've started giving presentations saying, if you're not interested in changing your company, then don't even consider a smart contract, because it's not a slight change. It's a step change. in efficiency. And it's a step change in how you do things. So, and I'll give you a real example. If I'm an oil and gas company and I've got a 34-step process for paying an invoice, and I do that for hundreds of thousands of invoices every single year, and I can change that into a 2-step automated process, then I've freed up all those people to do something rather than menial tasks of checking invoices and getting bored out of their minds. They can start doing something more interesting. But the company has to be prepared to say, okay, I'm going to take this 34-step process, I'm going to collapse it to a 2-step process, make my company more efficient as a result of that, and hopefully improve the lives of, we've got drilling engineers, drilling rigs who are spending 25-50% of their time chasing paper. And they're engineers, they're highly educated, intelligent people. What the heck are they doing chasing pieces of paper and arguing with people? That's not a fulfilling use of their time and their life, and that's not why they went to university. So
Right.
I think that the challenge is for companies to be prepared to make the change to take advantage of the technology.
Yeah. And I think there's often fear too, right? Oh, I'm going to lose my job or this or that. And like you said, it's not necessarily about that. It's about how do you optimize this person's time? You have a talented person. Why are they spending their time, like you said, chasing paper or doing calculations that could very easily be done with an automated solution?
I think that it can't be underestimated. We were talking to one company and they said, we were worried about talking about this to this particular company about the efficiencies that were going to be gained. And the operations manager said, thank God, he says, we can get back to being engineers rather than invoice engineers. So, there are so many people who in really dead-end, boring jobs, chasing paper and checkers, checking the checkers. I was talking to one oil company the other day. They said they've got 4 10-story buildings of people and all they do is check paper.
Wow.
And I can't imagine that job. So what happens if you unleash the creativity and brain power of those people to start doing more interesting things, designing more interesting machines, designing more interesting processes, better ways of running a business, as opposed to just checking paper every day. Like I said, it's a step change. And it is a significant step change. But for companies who are interested in differentiating themselves or being more competitive, it is a very real way of achieving that.
It makes me think of lean management. I have
I'm
spent
glad
a
you said
long
that.
time teaching classes on this with a Houston-based company. And in the classes, what we would do is, choose a process. So this was all from one specific company, a state-owned oil company, actually. And so they would bring people over for these trainings, and haven't done it since COVID, unfortunately, but I really enjoyed them. But you're basically working with all people at the same company. And so together we would choose a process. And it was almost always, it's funny you say this about invoicing, right? It was almost always an invoice or procurement type thing that we would map out. And then we would map out, right, all the steps. Like you said, there's 34 steps, multiple checks where it has to go back to somebody for their signature. And that person is a busy executive and it takes them 2 weeks to sign the document. I mean, just crazy. And once you see it on a board, you think, oh my God, that's crazy. No wonder everyone's so frustrated about this process, or no wonder we're not getting paid on time, right? No wonder we have these really high admin costs. But if you can eliminate steps in that process, everyone wins.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm really glad you said that, because the way my early versions of the presentation that I used to do for the company, when I was with NOV, we spent a lot of time looking at internal processes, manufacturing processes, mostly for getting pieces of equipment out of the door more cost effectively and more profitably and with reduced lead times. It's a huge, we had a huge backlog and we had to get equipment out the door. So when I first started looking into these smart contracts, I thought exactly the same, because we used to do the same thing. We'd have people from engineering, manufacturing, finance, executive management, quality control, the whole gamut of different departments, and we would draw the process on the wall. It would take up the whole wall. And then you'd have these lean manufacturing guys saying, well, why does this take so long? And what happens if you cut that step? And what's it required? And so you take like 10 steps out of this process, and you would reduce the cost of the machine by 30%. You'd reduce the delivery time by 50%. And when I first saw smart contracts is exactly the same concept, exactly what you just said. You don't need all those steps. If you can trust the sensor, because you probably need it because it's operational, and you've got an agreement on price or whatever else it is, you don't need anything else.
Right.
And it's, especially if you cross-reference it. And so you don't need all these redundant steps.
It's eliminate the waste, right? Eliminate
That's exactly
the waste.
right. Exactly what it is.
I wanted to ask you, someone else, I can't remember which conversation I was having, where someone brought this up as a potential barrier, which is, what about, we know a lot of companies play with payment terms to, manage their cash flow. Are some companies not interested because they're suddenly going to be paying on time or going to have to, either pay automatically, or perhaps do you build payment terms into some of the smart contracts? How does that work? Or is it kind of just, we have to start accepting that if we're going to run an efficient business, we might have to pay people on time?
There are so many answers to your question. Let me just quickly go through them. So there's two different sides to the transaction, and it's a win-win. It's not a win-lose. So you got the buyer and the seller. So for the buyer, I know that I'm only paying for what is actually delivered. Big point. I've got transparency into what my spend is in real time. Huge point. I can get access to fast pay discounts. There was a large company in Houston who was bought recently. They had $1 million in pre-negotiated, undisputed discounts available to them, but they couldn't realize them every single month because there's $1 million in discounts. They couldn't realize every single month because they couldn't get through the invoices quick enough. You don't necessarily change the payment terms. You've automated the execution of the transaction, but it doesn't mean that you don't pay in 30 days. You can still do that. There's trade finance options. So there's a lot of banks who are very interested in smart contract confirmed payments. And so they will offer very interesting and attractive financing terms on that. Oh, and then there's, the back office expensive. For the seller, they actually get paid for performance delivered without dispute. And that was actually how we got into blockchain in the first place, to solve the, how do you get paid for a performance contract problem, back office expenses, getting paid on time, and then more creative contracts. So because the contract execution is automated, it's not a huge administrative burden to have an interesting contract. So I can offering new business lines or new payment terms, or maybe I get paid for performance, so the density in the well rather than the amount of mud that's delivered, for example. So you can negotiate things, so you can start differentiating your company from the competition. So there's win-win on both sides. So yes, the obvious objection is, well, I don't want to pay on time or quicker because I'm managing my cash. Well, smart contracts don't force that situation.
Interesting. Okay. Let me just bring it back real quick to the ES and G piece. I do think blockchain, generally speaking, and I know it's kind of overused, but generally speaking, is going to really improve governance, broadly speaking, in the market, simply because, as you say, it's creating trust. And a lot of the need for governance related disclosure is because there isn't trust, right? So I think, broadly speaking, it's very interesting, even if the data, the actual data that your technology can produce is related to the actuals, mostly on the E side, right? So the fuel, the water, the waste, et cetera. So I just wanted to make that connection. And then just ask, I know you guys are thinking really broadly about how to create an ecosystem for improving ESG data. Do you want to spend a few minutes telling us about that?
Yeah, I'd like to make one point before I do that. And I'm really interested in your opinion. So this is a off the cuff discussion. So hopefully I don't catch you by surprise, because I think you probably know the answer, and I'm really interested in your answer. We were talking to a very large company recently about the ability to defensively prove the E and the S portion of the ESG reporting. And based on actual facts, brought it to Bill and going back to the actual reading from the real world. And they freaked out They said, we don't want to provide that level of transparency. That is terrible. And so I'm interested in your reaction to that statement, because we were flabbergasted. We said, well, actually, that's a bit of a problem. And it's a large publicly traded company. So what would you do in that circumstance? And do you think that's prevalent? What's your gut reaction?
That's the attorneys doing their job, which is they see new regulation coming. It's uncertain what that regulation will be. The securities lawyers are, I think, worried about putting anything out right now. In fact, I've working with certain clients and certain projects. Certain ones are more risk averse than others. But yes, that's a very common thing we're hearing right now, with the expectation that there will be regulation. And just, I'm almost seeing a pullback in transparency, where a lot of companies that have been very transparent for several years are starting to say, ooh, should we really say that? Or where's the back office audit of this before we put it out there? So I think there is an increased level of caution. I'm not surprised about that. And at the same time, I think that's, we, again, looking at the big picture of this, if what we're moving toward are capital markets that are more transparent, capital markets that integrate negative externalities into the decision-making process, right? Where we're basically internalizing those externalities. Again, we're talking at a very high level here, but there's going to be discomfort with those changes, and there's going to be certainly pushback from lots of different groups and stakeholders, and a lot of well-meaning attorneys that are doing their job, trying to protect their company from litigation. And at the same time, the bigger picture is, a more transparent and hopefully resilient economic system where capital markets are clear on where the risks lie, where capital markets can compare different companies that they want to invest in. And I've always said, it's not that investors don't want to take a risk. They just want to know what the risk is, right? And they want to have a better idea of that the company that they're investing in understands those risks as well. And so that's a long answer. Doesn't surprise me. But yeah, unfortunately, I think
it's almost a matter of, I don't want to go first. I don't want to be the first person to take my pants down in public. I want other people to do it with me. And so until the investment community and or regulatory environment forces it, maybe people don't want that level of transparency.
And I think you're right. A lot of companies don't, especially, there's sort of a pack mentality with different peer group, right? The peer group, and I'll tell you, the first thing every new client wants us to do is peer benchmarking. Where do we fit among our peers? It makes sense. I mean, that's how executive compensation is determined, right? It makes sense. And at the same time, it can almost hold an industry back in some ways when no one wants to take a step. And that's where, like you said, you're part of IADC, the International Association of Drilling Contractors. A lot of these industry associations are really where some of that collaboration needs to happen and can happen to get everyone comfortable with, frankly, it's a level of transparency that's outgoing, but there's enough algorithms. I mean, MSCI knows what your emissions are, whether or not you report them. There's enough I've seen of these demos and data sources, and they show you how they estimate, and they're almost always very close to correct. So it's kind of like, well, we don't want to be the one to put it out there 100% first. And at the same time, somebody else is estimating it. So it's just kind of, I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy in a way, where people think that they want to protect their data, but and I understand it. Again, I work with a lot of those very intelligent securities lawyers that are doing their job, but MSC already knows what your numbers are. So
I think there's also a certain, you can dip your toe into the water aspect of this, right? You don't, you can say, okay, I will report on wastewater with provable smart contracts and defensible, data behind it. But I don't have to say I'm going to boil the ocean and do my whole company day one.
Absolutely.
And so I think there is a way that people can say, okay, let me try this out. And if I like it and I get good response from the investment community, then okay, I'll add the next bit, and then I'll add the next bit. It doesn't have to be a boil the ocean.
That's right.
I think that's probably a good way that people can try it out without getting burned.
Yeah, I think so. And, again, that industry level collaboration is important for these sorts of things because it helps get everyone comfortable, right? And everyone kind of on the same page. Again, if the end goal is more efficient markets, more sustainable society, people living better on Earth, it's sort of a matter of time, in my opinion. And so, yes, it's always a risk to be first, but it's also a great opportunity.
I completely agree. It goes back to the differentiation, right? If some people can say, okay, I'm going to take a lead on this and I'm going to differentiate myself and then invite investment dollars because of that. So I think that some people are going to take the lead on that and they are going to get a jump on everybody else. That's probably going to be the catalyst actually for this change, which is required.
I love the idea of a company being the first to essentially do all of their reporting based on smart contracts, SASB, say, you've got the 98% overlap. It's probably a few governance related questions that aren't in your system, and have all of that presented as such, which is like all of our ESG data is real time. It's aligned with SASB. It sits on a blockchain. We don't even need to audit it because, you can, but it's all there. It's all verified. I think that's it would be very interesting to see a company be the first to do that. Like you said, I think it is the future.
Somebody is going to be first. It's a matter of who's that's going to be. And it may not be one of the companies that you expect.
Mm-hmm.
And it could well be one of the smaller ones. This is going to sound terrible, but it's true. There are some companies who welcome smart contracts because they operate very efficiently and they have very clean business practices. There are some companies who hate the idea of a smart contract because they make their money in the gray areas. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a similar thing. I'm trying to be careful how I say that. But I think the same thing is going to be true with ESG. There are some people who are proud of their performance. And I want to shout it from the rooftops and have a platform for doing it. Those are the guys who will be the first.
Very true. Andrew, this has been wonderful. I assume this is going to be one of those episodes where people have a lot of follow-up questions. So I'm just going to point them to, go ahead and make them in the comments on LinkedIn, where our ESG Decoded page is, or on the other social media channels where ESG Decoded lives. Feel free to, engage, ask those questions, and we'll make sure that Andrew gets them and we can answer them online for you. If you want to learn more about Data Gumbo, hit them up at datagumbo.com. And, before we close, I should ask about your name, Data Gumbo. In Houston and Louisiana, we all know what that's all about, but maybe you can tell us. I should say Texas and Louisiana. We know all about that, but how did you come up with the name?
Yes, it's difficult to come up with a unique domain name, company name. We didn't want to be too associated with oil and gas. We wanted to be general, and it had to be something with data. So we literally spent months trying to find a unique name. And we were just sitting around in the pub one day, as you would expect. And the whole idea of taking a whole bunch of data from a whole different bunch of sources, standardizing it, aggregating it, making it taste good. Somebody said, well, what about Data Gumbo? And we all just burst out laughing. What a stupid idea. And then it stuck. So that's where the name came from, because we didn't start out as a blockchain company. We started out as a data aggregator, because we needed, going back to the very beginning of this podcast, creating an autonomous rig, you need data from lots of different sources from companies that don't like each other very much. And so you need to be able to aggregate it, standardize it, make it available to do interesting stuff. And that's actually how you get to scope 3 emissions reporting. Because if you're delivering on a rig, you're getting data from an offshore vessel provider, or from the rig provider, or for the service company, or for the oil company. So all participants in the supply chain are involved in the transaction. So that gives you very good access to scope 3 emissions. So sorry, we didn't get into that, and I'm going off on a tangent.
That's okay.
But that's how we got into Data Gumbo, is because we wanted a name that kind of represented the whole idea of getting data in one place and doing interesting stuff. And then it just became a laugh. And then people have tried to change it since then. And people said, no, you can't change it. So anyway, it's stuck.
It's stuck. Yeah, I love it.
Well, people remember it.
Yeah, it's easy to remember, and it kind of just, hey, you know what? It's noon. I think it's time for lunch. Let's go get some
Exactly right.
Like, I always enjoy talking to Andrew because then I want to go have Creole food. All right. Well, thank you so much again. We're really grateful to have had you today. And again, follow-up questions, engage with us on social media, and check them out at datagumbo.com.
Thank you for listening to ESG Decoded. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours, and follow ESG Decoded and Global Affairs Associates across social media platforms. Until our next episode, take what you learned today to drive long-term value for your organization by doing good for people and for the planet.